Hello, welcome to my podcast and my YouTube channel. I have someone very special with me today. I just finished a course online with him and I absolutely loved it. It was on psychotherapy.net, which is it's a place for us mental health professionals to learn with those who have been doing this for a long, long time. So John Sommers-Flanagan is with us today. Thank you, John, for being with us.
Hi, Paula. Thank you for
And
having me.
welcome.
Thank you.
Let me just talk a little bit about you. So John is a clinical psychologist. He's also a professor at the University of Montana. It's the counseling program, right?
Right. I'm in the counseling department.
Yes. And he has written, I don't know how many books, but I can't possibly mention them all here. Most of them were written for us, mental health professionals, and we have all learned a lot with him. So John, thank you so much for being here with us and to sharing your knowledge. I know you've been doing this for a long time and you have so much to share.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Mm-hmm. Let's start with why. Why did you become a psychologist?
Wow, that's a long story, and so we could take all of
That's
our
okay.
time.
I'm sure you can be brief. You've written books.
Yes, right. Well, I was an undergraduate at Oregon State University, and I had no major, and somehow I ended up picking psychology because I'd had a couple of psychology classes that I had really liked, and I was a junior, and so I really had to declare a major. It was that, or they would kick me out. So I declared psychology, and then I had an experience in a pre-practicum where I did some counseling with someone and was observed by others. And it's like they said I was really good at it. And I had never been told that I was good at anything other than sports. I had done, sports my whole life, and I was still doing collegiate sports. But they said I was good at this counseling thing. And it turned out I just really loved it. And I felt like I was pretty good at it. And so, yeah, that's really how I first got started. And then I worked in a psychiatric hospital, and then I went to the University of Montana and got my degree in clinical psychology. And yeah, and here I
Well,
am.
I'm glad you did. And you have been treating that's why you're here mainly. You've been treating suicidal patients for a long time. That's actually the course that I took online, how to handle suicidal patients. And that's what I want to focus on today, our conversation.
Yes,
If that's okay with you, because I know that's an area that you're passionate about.
right. I am passionate about it.
Yeah, I
And
could tell.
and one of the reasons that I am is, and I don't know if you're familiar with this story, is that in the 1990s, early 90s, I was working with a 15-year-old boy who died by suicide, and obviously devastating emotionally, and really made me question myself. And I was really filled with self-doubt about whether or not I wanted to ever work with any other person at all, or especially anybody who was depressed. Um,
Hmm.
and so, in some ways, I think my focus or my dedication to it is a product of wishing and wanting to have been better and to do better in the future.
Wow, no, I didn't know about this story. And it's funny you mentioned that because I did interview someone in Brazil. He was a psychologist too, and
Hmm.
his first patient took his life. He
Wow.
never he never went back.
Oh yeah, yeah.
No, he gave up on it.
That would be so hard. And I had already written some material about suicide assessment before this happened. And so it wasn't that I didn't know, and I was working with a lot of difficult clients at the time. Um, but it just made me aware of how vulnerable we all are to losing people, whether it's clients or family members. And so that was kind of a reckoning or an awakening for me at that point in time.
Hmm. Well, as you said, we all know someone who may be suicidal. We just don't,
Mhm.
sometimes we're just not looking hard enough. We just don't know. Sometimes we don't know how to identify the signs and all of that. So let's start with this. Let's say you know someone and you think, wow, I think my friend or my family member is thinking about suicide or contemplating taking his or her life. How should we approach them, John? What should we avoid, and what do we have to pay attention to, even in terms of language?
Right, right. You know, I know that you have done many podcasts on this, and I know that you recently interviewed Stacy Friedenthal, who, of course, knows an immense amount about this, and I think gave some fabulous advice. So I'm promoting your previous podcast, but from my perspective, um, really, what we need to be is more relational. Um, you'd mentioned missing the signs, right? Or not being aware of the signs. And the truth is, the science indicates there are no perfect signs and there are no very good predictors of suicide. And so we shouldn't really blame ourselves if we don't see the signs, but instead, we should, with everybody, just really do our best at making an interpersonal connection, one that is filled with compassion and the desire to have empathy. I mean, I just think that's the way we should always be as a rule. Now, if you suspect somebody is suicidal, then of course the very general advice of asking directly is important. But I also believe, and I learned this back in the 1980s from a professor of mine named Jan Wallersheim, and she was a psychologist and she had an expertise and had written in this area. And she said, we want to make the quote or supposed deviant response more acceptable, both to us and to the patient or the client or the friend. And the way we do that is to normalize it. And and that's supported also by the research in that many, if not most people, have from time to time had at least had passing suicidal thoughts. And so the idea that we normalize it by saying something like Paula, um, it's not unusual when people have had hard things happen in their lives, like you have had recently. Maybe, you know, I don't know all the details, but it's not unusual for people to also think about suicide. And so, as your friend, as your colleague, as somebody who cares about you, um, I'm wondering if you've had thoughts like that.
Mhm. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But it's the one thing that all of us are afraid to ask.
And so, you know, what I would recommend for everyone, and I do this with my students in classes, but is practice it. You know, practice saying the words, even by yourself. And you could see me say it in my way. And there are many different ways to say that. And it could be related to me saying, well, I know you've had some hard things happen. It could be that I know that you have a diagnosis of depression or bipolar disorder, or maybe I know something like that. And and to frame it as it's just not unusual. It's not unusual for high school students. You know, somewhere between 30 to
Mhm.
50% of high school students are having some suicidal thoughts that they're troubled by. And so as a parent, it's okay to say that to your kids, to say, oh, it wouldn't be unusual. I would love to be the kind of parent who you could tell that to, because I love you so much that I would want to know if you were in that kind of distress or pain.
Mhm. I know that you're a big fan of Dr. Edwin Schneiderman because I've heard you mention him a few times. That's
Hmm.
one thing we have in common. I actually
Yes.
had the privilege of interviewing him a few
Yeah.
months before he passed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's amazing. I wish I'd had the opportunity. I never met him personally.
Hmm.
So
But remember, and I'm mentioning him because it's two questions, right? That's what he used to say. Two questions you ask. One is
Hmm.
where does it hurt? And the second one is how can I help? That's
Right.
the next step, right? So how can they help? How can my listener help if they're in that position? So you ask
Right.
the question, normalize it, say, just take it in, be empathetic. What
Yeah.
else?
Well, I would follow Edwin Schneiderman's advice there too. And how can we help? And that is to help reduce the pain, right? Because everybody who has a thought of suicide is probably also experiencing, what he called psychache,
Psychic, yeah.
what Rita and I sometimes call excruciating distress. Edwin Schneiderman called it unbearable psychological pain, and at least pain that feels unbearable to the person who's having it. And so really our assignment is to, what can I do? How can I be helpful? That's what I'm thinking. I might not just say that directly, but and one of the models that Rita and I have been writing about, and we'll have a book that actually will come out, I think, in February, that focuses on this, but that is, everybody has different sort of dimensions of the self, right? And
Mhm.
we have a social self, we have a mental self or a cognitive self, right? We have an emotional self, we have spiritual selves. And so,
Relational
yes,
self, yeah.
absolutely. And so we want to be able to just be aware of the whole person that we're with. And so we might ask about what's hurting and where it's hurting. Is it,
Hmm.
tell me more about it. As Stacy Friedenthal said, tell me the story that has led up to you feeling this
Feeling
way
this way,
now.
yeah.
I want to hear it, and I would love to try to understand. Now, one thing I would say, don't say,
Mm.
um, and I intentionally say, I want to try to understand, but we shouldn't say to our friends or our clients, I understand, because almost always
Yeah.
we don't. I mean, how can
No,
we really?
no, yeah. Yeah, and I think you lose the connection there sometimes when you say that, because the immediate reaction they have said, no, you don't. Of course you
Yeah,
don't, right? How can
right.
you?
Well, and if you say that to a teenager, they will actually swear at you and tell you how clear
Because
it
they're more
is.
honest.
Right, yeah. They might say something like, how could you effing possibly
Yeah.
understand me?
I'm so glad you mentioned this, because this whole self is something that when they are in that state of constriction,
Hmm.
it's so hard to see the whole picture. So I was thinking that you mentioned that let's bring hope into the
Yeah,
conversation, right? How
right.
important that is to actually broaden that perspective. So
Hmm.
what does that mean to bring hope into the conversation? Can you give some practical examples that my listeners can use?
Sure, sure. To lay out the problem, like you said, there's a
Mhm.
mental constriction in people who, according to Schneidman, and really according to a lot of research, who are feeling suicidal, are feeling that sense of, I either must continue to endure this unbearable pain, or I might die, or I might kill myself. And by doing that, I could relieve the pain. So um, Schneidman and Aaron Beck, a psychologist who wrote a lot about suicide also, wrote about hopelessness as a predictor of suicide. And his point would be that people have a problem solving impairment, right? So how can we help with hope? Well, one of the things is to first have empathy and say, Paula, I hear you feeling like you've tried everything. I hear you saying that nothing you have ever tried has ever helped, and you don't think anything ever will, right? Instead
Mhm.
of saying, and you should have hope, then after having the empathy, um, to be able to share, you know, I know you don't have hope, and I know it feels like you've tried everything, but I'm wondering um, if there was a way for us to focus on the pain and to make the pain less. I'm wondering if it would be okay for us to talk about that. And in some ways, you're separating then the pain from the person and then working on that together with them. And oftentimes, and this is really interesting, is that people will say, well, yeah, I would be better, but there's nothing I could possibly do. And with permission, and I would say, well, Paula, is it okay if I share some ideas that might be helpful or that might be hopeful? And you would maybe say yes, and I would list things off, and you would say, no, they're all terrible ideas. No, that's stupid. I might say, well, the research shows that
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
exercise, and you say, no, that's stupid, I hate exercise. And then I say, well, some people take antidepressant medications, and oh,
Mm-hmm.
I tried that. I wasn't myself. I hated that. No, I might, and so you can see that I
And you
might
keep
offer some
going and
ideas.
keep trying, right?
Yeah, I might offer some ideas. And then really, and this is an interesting thing about hope, is that people who are hopeless oftentimes want to focus there first. And so then I might say, well, Paula, of those things I mentioned, and maybe other things that you've tried, what was the worst? What was the thing that really didn't help at all? And you
Why
might
would you
say,
ask that? It's
oh, because
curious.
that's usually what the hopeless person is aware of. And
Mm.
and the other reason is because, and I want to have empathy for that. And I want to say, and the other issue is, it's not black white thinking that the person who's suicidal is having. Oftentimes they're having black thinking. They've just got,
Mm.
it's all hopeless, right? Everything feels like it's in this sea of hopelessness and nothing could possibly help. And so I want to make a distinction between what you hate the most versus what you
Mm-hmm.
hate a little bit less, and what you hated a little bit less than that. So I would ask things like, okay, so what did you hate the most? Maybe you say,
Mm-hmm.
well, I hated being on antidepressant medications because it made me numb. I felt like I wasn't even myself. And I say, well, one thing for sure, let's not try antidepressant medications. I hear you saying that was the worst. We should never
Mm-hmm.
try that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about relationships, John? Because sometimes they'll say, well, because one of the things we know that helps a lot is reaching out, right?
Right, right.
Having support. So if you say, okay, is there someone that you can talk to? You go,
And
no,
they,
nobody understands, right?
yeah, right,
Nobody will
right,
understand.
right.
So where do you go from there?
Well, again, I would start with the worst. If it's somebody who's really depressed and who's severely depressed or very suicidal and very hopeless, I would start with the worst. I'd say, well, who's somebody who absolutely would be the worst person for you to possibly talk to? And almost everybody would say, oh, I would never talk to my dad. That would be the worst. I'd say, okay, so let's not do that.
Let's keep that one on the list.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and so then who would be a little bit less bad? And then who would be less bad than that? And then so you kind of work your way up to, well,
Mm-hmm.
and almost always, so two things happen. I just did a simulation with a person a week and a half ago with this, and she said, it was crazy. I just started thinking, well, who's a little better? Well, who's a little better? And it's like you start to get that pattern of thinking with somebody, and it doesn't always work. It could easily fail, but almost always they know what you're doing. And you're trying to go up the continuum to people who are less bad. And so
Mm-hmm.
then they're starting to think that way. And then pretty soon they say something like, well, my friend Robert, he wouldn't be bad, but I don't want to burden him, it would be bad. And so then you've got something, right? Then you could say, well,
Yeah.
so Robert would be a possibility, but you wouldn't want to burden him. I wonder if there's a way for you to talk with Robert and have it not be a burden. Maybe there's a way. And the other way of framing it is to get the person outside of himself, herself, their self, and say, what do you think Robert would think? How would Robert how do you think Robert maybe would think it's a burden too, or you think you're protecting him? Maybe he would be grateful to be a person who could help you.
Hmm.
So you start to build in some other kinds of thoughts. And again, we know that it's quite possible for a person who's in a suicidal crisis to to just dismiss all of those.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've done some good empathic work first by just being with them in their pain, and then you start to work with them to come up with alternative ideas that could bring a little hope in the area of relationships or activities, I I think more often than not, even the suicidal person will feel a little pull that direction, so that they might come with you a little bit. In some ways, the old psychoanalytic ideas were that we are letting our clients borrow our hope, to borrow our healthy functioning ego, because theirs is not feeling up to it. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but also we also know that there is ambivalence, and that's
of
where we
course.
help them, because if there were no ambivalence, we would never be able to help, right?
Yeah, yeah. I have a story
Mm-hmm.
about that, which I could tell at the end if you want. But it's about a technique called the neo-dissociation technique, which
Mm-hmm.
is really about me saying to you or whoever I'm talking with, I know that you want, I know a part of you wants to die, but I know it's probably true that a part of you wants to live a healthy and less painful life. And so I'm wondering, can I talk with the part that wants to live? I'm happy to talk with the part that wants to die too, but I'm just curious if I could talk with the part that wants to live for a little while.
Hmm. Is that connected to what you call finding alternatives to suicide?
It's a little bit connected to that.
Hmm.
It's
Because
a
it's that part that's talking when you're building that list of alternatives, right?
it, usually, at least hopefully at the end. um, because sometimes, again, with a really depressed person, if you're building alternatives to suicide, they will just dismiss them all, and they're still in that sort of mindset of the
Mm.
I want to die. But hopefully by the end, with the alternatives to suicide, you hand them the sheet of paper, you have them rank the options themselves. It kind of empowers them. And it's
Mm-hmm.
a simultaneous assessment as well as intervention, because if they put suicide down as number 3 or 4, then you've got some things to try first.
Mm-hmm. What kind of alternatives can you give us some examples? What kind, maybe a case that you had?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. The one that comes to mind is the one that's actually on the psychotherapy.net video. And that's a woman who's feeling intensely suicidal. And we do this process of generating alternatives to suicide. And she's not really able to even come up with any. I'm not sure what you mean, she says. And well, I mean, like, how about, would you want to have time with your family? And or would you be interested in volunteering somewhere and doing something for other people? And in the process, she identifies horses, and I say, oh, maybe you could do some recreational things with horses, and maybe you could do volunteer work with horses. And she's, you know, I'm just writing them down as alternatives. I say something, and she finally kind of brightens up a little bit and says, well, I used to volunteer and help kids. And I say, oh, so we could put that down. And so I put it down, but just in the context of all the rest. Um, and in the end, what I think is most profound about that particular case is she says, well, I can't figure this out. I mean, suicide is maybe 3 or 4, right? But I can't do those things. I don't know how to get this organized. And I,
Mm-hmm.
and then we decide that she needs somebody to be her planner. And she's
Okay.
like, yeah, she's like, oh, well, yeah, if somebody could do my planning, then, and so we talk about her husband. And so then her husband can be the one who supports her and helps her plan to re-engage with some volunteer work with children, which gives her a little bit of hope. And then she also wants more time with him and with her kids. And so we can weave those kinds of things in. But and Schneidman was really big on this, that we need to recruit sometimes family members or supportive friends to help people enact those, to help them get re-involved in those activities that might be less depressing and more life embracing.
Hmm. I want to talk about that. You just mentioned sometimes you have to involve family members or
Hmm.
friends. How can you do that, tactfully?
Hmm.
Because, for example, family, sometimes that's the source of the problem.
Right, right.
So how can we involve these and even convince the person that let's get, a group of people together to help support you?
Hmm. Hmm.
Because that can be
Yeah,
a challenge. It can be a
so
real
hard.
challenge.
So hard because it's natural for people when they are feeling bad to want to isolate themselves, right? And it's natural for them to imagine that any interactions they have will just be painful and depressing, right? That's the hopelessness. Um, and so it's very difficult to get them away from that leaning toward isolation. Um, I'll quote Marsha Linehan because I think she's really effective in some of her direct ways of being with people who are suicidal. One of the things that she sometimes says is, um, this therapy I'm going to do with you will work. It has a track record of working. Of course, it doesn't work for everybody all the time, but the track record is good. But I can tell you right now, it never works for dead people. And she's very straightforward about that. And
That's
she
very
says,
straightforward.
and so I want to work with you. And I know it might take us 4 months or 6 months, and it might feel like we're going through hell together. But I want you to work with me to make your life better and less painful. And I will walk with you through this process. But I need to have you be alive to do it.
Mm,
And sometimes I'm going to tell you, Paula, sometimes things that you should do, and you will not want to do them.
mhm,
And even though you don't want to do them, and this is an interesting thing, the research suggests that if you do engage in these things, even though at first they don't help, over time they begin to help. And and she really tries to hook, she talks about wise mind, right? And she tries to hook
mm,
that more thoughtful, healthier side of the
mhm,
individual and speak to that part so that they will engage in the treatment. And the treatment involves time with other people.
mhm.
Uh, and I do think it needs to be done in a way that totally acknowledges, even though right now you don't think this will help, we need to test that.
Mhm.
We need to do an experiment, because one thing we know about people who are suicidal is that they spoil potentially good experiences before the experiences even have a chance to be good, right?
Yeah. And they see themselves in that. And you're saying
Yeah,
this, and I'm thinking about this person because of the work that I've been doing for many years. And I have a website, and in Brazil, I have a lot of people write to me through the website.
yeah,
And one of them, and I'm going to connect that to a question that you use. He started like it's exactly what you just mentioned. He started saying, "Don't even try telling me that I have reasons to live." So he started
yeah.
something. Yeah, he started like that. I mean, that's how he started the email. And he said, I have a good family. I don't believe in medication. I have never had a diagnosis. It's just existential. I existentially do not believe in living. I
Hmm.
get no pleasure out of it. I don't believe in humans. And he just went on and on. So it was very existential. So, how do you
Yeah,
dialogue with that?
right. Just before I respond, I just want to say how great I think it is that you are doing this podcast and you have your website resource and that you're responding to people's emails. And what an amazing contribution that you're making. So
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you for that. I mean, it's because there are people we know out in the world who are in incredible psychological and emotional pain. And the fact that you can be a lifeline for some of them, magnificent.
And you know what,
So,
John? It takes so little. That's why I believe in interaction in relationships,
mhm,
because they never believe a right back.
yeah,
And when I do, it changes everything for them sometimes.
right, right. Because their expectation is that they will be perpetually disappointed and that you will disappoint them too. So they don't expect you to write back. And so, like you said, sometimes it doesn't take that much to be a caring person who writes back and makes
Yeah,
somebody's day.
yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. I have to tell a
okay.
story though, John,
Yeah, yeah,
because you
yeah,
mentioned that. Because I had a one only happened once. Because usually when I reply, it just brightens up their lives in some ways,
yeah,
and it gives them hope that there is at least someone listening, right? But I
yeah,
did have one person. That was the hardest interaction I ever had, and I think it
yeah.
was the only one that I gave up on,
Oh no,
because
what? What
because
happened?
he started being so rude to me. At the end, he was saying, you know what, I think this is all rehearsed and that you are a robot. You're not really responding to me. And I'm going, oh my God, what is the end of this, right? So I said, okay, I'm a robot. He thought it was an automatic response.
You know
But
what?
it just shows how hard, I mean, how constricted they are sometimes,
Yes,
right?
right, right. So even though you're responding in a genuine way,
Yeah.
he spoils it, right? He sees it as
Sabotage,
you
self
are
sabotage.
being robotic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
When
So
I
going
years
back
and
to,
so years and
oh,
years
sorry.
ago, so now I have a story. Years and years ago, I was working with a woman, and she told me that I was a robot, and that she thought if she cut open my arms, there would be wires and not veins. So I can relate to that.
You can relate. So we're both robots, right?
Uh, apparently,
Very advanced, though, because we're
yes.
having quite a good conversation here right now.
Right, right. We must be androids and not robots.
Androids are very advanced ones.
Yes.
Okay, existential. And I remember I asked you that. So when you get a
Yeah.
patient or a friend, a family member who says, no matter what you tell me, I just do not believe. There is nothing here for us.
Sure, sure. Right.
Where do you
So,
go from there, John?
yeah, so that's an existential, spiritual, religious. I mean, it's a kind of a high level intellectual way of being. And so I would want to try to go with them on that level for a little while, at least. And I mean, I have the existential 6 months to live question, which we can talk about later.
That's what I
Yeah.
meant. I wanted to connect because I think it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, and I may not use that right away with somebody. Instead, if they're into existentialism, I would ask them like, "So, who have you read? I mean, what is the what's are you reading Nietzsche? Are you
Yeah.
reading uh,
Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer?
Yeah.
Help me understand
Camus.
what." Yes, I want to know. Yeah, I mean, Camus, clearly believed that grappling with suicidality was like a
Is the
core
only
question.
exist, yeah.
It's the only
The only real question, right? Of
right,
existence of existence, yeah.
right. And so, I mean, in some ways, I'd be wanting to say, well, welcome to the club. I mean, it sounds to me like you are in an existential place, and other people, other great minds have been there too, and will be there later. And
Hmm.
so I'm trying to do a little bit of universality and connection first, right? And
Hmm.
and I got the 6 months to live question really from Irvin Yalom's work. It was
Yeah.
inspired by
Yeah.
his work because he discovered with people who were dying, who had early on in the AIDS epidemic and in some people who had terminal cancer, he found that they just got re-engaged in life. It's like they got a termination date,
Hmm.
and all of a sudden
Yeah.
they're back to fully engaged in life. And so, on one of the videos, I asked a woman, "Well, what if you just had 6 months to live? what would you want to do? How would you want to spend your life if you just had 6 months? And what that does is it can take people out of the philosophical, right? Out of the existential into the, whoa, wait a minute. Okay, so I got 6 months. What do I want to do? And it becomes a more practical question.
Hmm. Yeah,
Now,
and it also shows reasons for living, right?
exactly.
And
Reasons for living.
motivation,
Totally.
what brings joy to your life, because you're going to focus on those, right?
Right.
Hopefully.
Exactly. Engagement, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so if somebody spends 6 months doing things that they just don't want to postpone anymore, that they're not going to postpone living, they're going to really engage in things that they love. My guess is they do that for 6 months, they're not going to be so depressed as they were
Mm-hmm.
before that, right? And so,
Yeah,
yeah, it's about engagement, it's about motivation, it's about
yeah.
reasons for living.
Yeah, the other existential question that Yalom uses to that I love is, what if you had to relive your life over
Uh,
and over and over again? That gets you thinking,
right, right. It
doesn't it?
does. Yeah. Yeah. And it gives you a chance to look back at things that you might have regretted and to look at your current life and to try not to replicate the regrets too much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Okay, I know that our time is limited, so I want to talk about what you call risk dimensions. You mentioned 8. We don't have time for all of them,
Mhm.
but I want you to first of all explain what are risk dimensions that you need to look at.
Well, so a lot of times we look at risk factors. And the problem with that is that there are so many, right? There are now literally hundreds,
Too many,
uh,
too
too
many.
many.
Yeah.
We cannot remember them all. And so I like to organize things into dimensions and say, well, so what is it in the spiritual existential dimension? You know, how is the person doing? I might ask you. We haven't talked about religion or spirituality. I'm wondering what your thoughts and feelings are in that area. If you're comfortable to tell me about that. So, so now I'm looking in that dimension, and I know that a sense of meaninglessness or spiritual or religious disconnection could contribute to suicidality. Um, and it might be any one of a number of specific things, right? It could be an LGBTQ plus person who has been rejected by a religious
Mm,
community and labeled and judged. And so that would be super important for me
mm-hmm,
to know about. And then we can work in the spiritual, religious, existential dimension and try to help the person to get reconnected somewhere, somehow, in a way that's meaningful. Um, and and so it's kind of beyond risk factors. I mean, we know the hopelessness and problem solving impairments is in the cognitive dimension, right?
mm-hmm,
Well, there also are lots of other cognitive things that could contribute to um, increased risk, in, including kind of a cognitive behavioral impulsiveness, right? Including self-deprecatory or really negative thoughts about the
mm-hmm,
self. Um,
mm-hmm.
and so rather than thinking, well, what are the risk factors? I want to go into that cognitive dimension and try to assess what's hurting in that dimension. What are the troubles there, and what are the strengths there, and
Yeah.
what can we grow?
And also, what is the relevance? Because when we talk about risk factors, they're so static, right?
Right.
And what is a risk factor? For me, it may be irrelevant, but for you, it's major, right?
Absolutely. I mean,
So,
so
I like
two
the idea of dimensions, because you actually look at what's important for that individual.
yes, two important ones that are very interesting. One is cutting, right? People who are
Mm-hmm.
cutting, are
Mm-hmm.
they at higher risk or are they at lower risk? Well, we don't know that until we ask them, until we
No.
are with them and understand the purpose of the cutting. If the cutting is exclusively for affect regulation, it might be a helpful thing. Not that we
Mm-hmm.
want them to continue that forever, but we're not going to intervene there. on the other hand, if it's a progressive cutting that seems to be related to desensitization, right? And
Sensitizing,
to,
yeah.
then we know it is a risk factor, and it is going to, and and then the other risk factor that kind of goes both ways hard, and that is a previous attempt. A previous attempt, of course, is usually the number one risk
Number one,
factor.
yeah. Risk
Yeah,
factor, yeah.
yeah. They recently did a study of the Columbia assessment device, and they found that no part of it was very useful at all. The only part of it that had much utility was previous attempt.
Hmm.
But we also know some people are strengthened by a previous attempt, and
Oh,
it
yes.
reduces their suicidality. But you don't know that until you talk with the person,
Until you
until you,
talk, I have interviewed people who have attempted, and it
yeah,
totally changed their lives for the best.
yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
I did. I had a young man who had shot himself in the forehead and had a bullet
Wow.
wound scar. And he's like, oh yeah, I learned so much, and I learned who loves me and cares about me and who doesn't. And
Mm.
I would never do that again. It's like, oh, it's a
Yeah.
protective factor for him.
Yeah, so yeah, it makes sense. So in your risk dimensions, one of them we have to talk about because of the moment we're living, which is
Mhm.
isolation, right?
Right, right,
Never before have we talked about this as much. It's all we
right.
read about, it's all we hear about. So can you talk a little bit about that? Social
Yeah.
isolation.
Well, yeah, and social isolation in the age of the pandemic, right, is we're all more vulnerable to it. And you know, I want to say that it is true that it's a bigger problem than ever. But also, if anybody out there is listening and feeling really isolated, I want to encourage them to, like right now with you, I feel like we're having this great conversation and I feel very connected. Is it the same as being in the same room? No, it's not.
No.
Is it better than me sitting home alone? Yes.
Yes. So
Yes.
let's define connection, right?
So let's redefine it. Let's recognize that even if it's not my perfect idea about interpersonal connectedness, that it's better than zero. And it feeds me in some ways for now that are important. And so that's a combination of the cognitive dimension and the interpersonal dimension, because it's so easy for us to get into that mindset where, darn it, this is COVID times. I can't be with people. I want to be with people and I can't be. And it's terribly frustrating. Totally agree with that. At the same time, the other half of that is, okay, so who can you call? Who can you Zoom?
Mm.
you know what kinds of, and there are internet groups that people meet together. There are internet singing groups that we could join and sing together. Would it be as good as being in the same room? Nah, probably not. Is it better than not singing with people? Yeah, it's better. And so
Yeah.
I think I want people to try to see that continuum of, yes, we're in a place of everything is less than our ideal. But that doesn't mean we have to live and deny ourselves the shreds of social contact that we can get. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, when I'm working with people online in counseling or in person in counseling now, it's a lot about, okay, it is horrible. Now, what are we going to do? Now, how will you get some feeling of connection? What are the best ways for you? And if the person's really depressed, they'll say, no way, it's impossible. And I'll say, okay, what's the worst way?
Yeah.
What's
I don't
what
like Zoom, right? Can't
I
stand
don't like
it.
Zoom. What's something else? What are the other options?
Yeah.
Old-fashioned calling or texting. A lot of teenage clients a lot of people, I have, gosh, it's probably the millennials and even the younger group. It's like, ah, they they will text, and it's
Milliseconds,
incredibly,
right?
ah,
They're
yeah,
so fast.
yeah,
I am the worst at texting. I hardly ever text.
yeah,
I usually just, I know people get annoyed with that, but I don't care. I record voice because I
yes,
can't stand texting. I
yes.
make so many mistakes. I spend more time correcting what I type than anything else.
I use voice to text, and the thing about that is it's so much faster, and you make hilarious mistakes. Um,
Well, can you imagine with an accent?
yes,
I
right.
don't use that very much.
No,
I
no.
sometimes I look and say, what the hell? I didn't
Yeah,
say that.
I didn't. Yeah, yeah. I, I
Okay.
have,
No,
yeah,
sorry, John. Just
no,
to end, I want to hear your view because we're talking about social isolation, and it has to do with ability to really have meaningful relationships. And I want to hear your view on this because I think that COVID highlighted these things so much. I mean, we see it's headlines now,
hmm
right? And what I find is that it really didn't create anything new in the way
yeah.
that we relate to others. And I think it's such a valuable and very rich moment for us to reflect on this. Am I isolated or have I always been isolated? Because I
Uh,
think it just highlights what was there already and it gives you a great
yeah,
place to really make changes. How do you
yeah,
see
yeah.
that?
I completely agree with what you're saying. Is it does highlight and exaggerate those things that we already were feeling or experiencing. Now, there are some exceptions in that there are some people who were very introverted before and didn't think that they really needed anything, right? And maybe they already were too isolated. And again, like you're saying, it might have just helped highlight that. But what I would, one recommendation I have is
Mm,
to switch around the way we're thinking about it, right? It shouldn't, maybe think not less about being isolated and more about who can I care for? Who can
mm,
I reach out to? Not because I'm feeling needy, although maybe I am, but who can I reach out to who might need to hear my voice or to see my text? And what that does is it does kind of an Adlerian thing, Alfred Adler, and it
mm,
helps us to focus on the other person, the other person's welfare. Not that
mhm,
it's more important than our welfare, because they're obviously mixed together. But I really think it's useful for people who are feeling isolated to say, wait, of course, it may be highlighting something I already was experiencing, but maybe this is a really good opportunity for me to think who might be feeling isolated and alone right now too, and who's going to really be um, touched by a communication from me. How can
mm.
I make a difference socially and relationally for
Yeah.
someone else?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I just had a friend of mine, very good friend of mine from my hometown, Recife in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
The other day he called me, Paula, you know what? Today is my father's birthday. Would you call him and just say hello? I mean, I was
Yeah,
never close to his father. I mean, I
yeah,
saw him a few times, but I said, you know what? I've been really spending time, John. I don't know if you feel the same, but I think that the older people, they got the worst of everything when it comes
oh,
to COVID. The
so hard,
worst. So
so
hard
hard.
for them. So I've been trying all the lives that I do when, interviews. I say, call your elderly, call them, contact them because they're so alone right now. So I
Yes,
said, you know what? I'm going to call him. I don't think he'll even remember me, but who cares, right? So I called. I said, okay, give
yeah,
me telephone number. And I called him. And of course he didn't remember. I think in the beginning he pretended. And I said, oh, you might, and I started like, this is Paula. You might remember I dated your son. We dated for years. I dated your son. And he goes, oh, and I could tell he really couldn't remember,
just
but who
trying to
cares?
pull that up.
I know. And
Paula, who?
yeah, right. I said, the journalist. And oh, yes, Paul. And so I just heard that you turned, and he had turned like 95.
Yeah.
I mean, cognitively perfect mind. And I
Wow.
started asking, just asking really deep questions. I started asking silly ones. And, what have you learned in 95? What are the most important things that happened in your life? And I just went on and on. And we talked for like an hour. And then I said, you know
Wow.
what? I'm going to call you every year now on your birthday. Okay, how about that? It's a great. And I mean, I hung up. 2 minutes later, I get a message from my friend. Say, what the hell happened, Paula? He just called me. He was ecstatic. That was the best conversation. What did you guys talk about?
Yeah.
And it was just, he was alone. That's it. And he just needed attention to someone and someone to really engage.
Yeah. Yeah. What a wonderful story, making me kind of feel a little misty-eyed there. So I
I
think
was,
that's
I was
fantastic.
emotional. Yeah. I was
Yeah.
emotional at the end because it was just a great conversation.
Hmm. My dad just turned 94, and
Mm-hmm.
he is bedridden, and so he's taken care of in a group setting, a small group home. My sister arranged for us to have as many people as we could send him cards because we couldn't have a party for him. And so he got about 50 cards from people who I know he had not seen or thought of for, 40, 50 years. So
Mm-hmm.
it was great. And it was one way, and it's not as good as a phone call from
Mm-hmm.
you. So, next year I'm having you call my dad.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll be happy.
Okay.
It was a great experience for both of us. It wasn't just me. I mean, just to hear from someone who's 95 was wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they have a different view. I mean, they lived in things that we see in movies, right?
Right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The whole
John,
idea of,
thank you so much for this conversation. I wish we could just
yeah.
go on and on and on, but
Yeah.
we both we both have things to do. Thank you
Do
for
you
your
have 2 minutes
time.
for me to
Oh
tell
yeah,
my
the
last story?
story.
Yeah.
Yes.
So years ago, after the boy that I worked with had died by suicide, and probably maybe 5 or 10 years after that, I'm working in an office, and the agency across the street calls me up. It's like almost 5 o'clock. I'm getting ready to go home, and they say, we've got a suicidal 15-year-old girl here, and we don't have anybody here to help her. Nobody here does counseling. Could you come across the street and meet with her? I go across the street. She's eloped from a psychiatric adolescent unit, and she just stopped by this building because it said community cares, and she thought, well, maybe somebody cares in there. And
Hmm.
so, but nobody could help her. I start to do the alternatives to suicide with her, and I'm going through, well, you could do this, you could do that, and you could do this. And she's like, no, 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 I couldn't do that. And then I have her rank them, and she ranks them, and she ranks suicide number 3. And
Hmm.
number 1, she has ranked get some family therapy with my parents. And number 2,
Wow.
she ranked go back to the adolescent unit and yell at them and tell them how terrible they were. Because that was one of the
Yeah, of
ideas that
course.
I
Yeah.
gave her. She came up with 0 ideas. I came up
Oh.
with about 10, right? So then I
Mm-hmm.
say, well, great, let's do these first 2. I guess we got to call the hospital and get you back there. No, she says, anybody calls the hospital, I'm going to go jump off the bridge. And there's a bridge
Hmm.
about 5 blocks away. And I'm like, sort of in I just said, well, we still have to call somebody to get back so you can try those first 2 things. And
Mm-hmm.
so she gets up, she leaves, I follow her, I'm going around the block with her, and I'm trying to lead her back. And she says, I know you're trying to lead me back. I said, of course I'm trying to lead you back. I want you to live. I want you to
Oh
live
my God, that's
a
scary. That sounds
yeah.
scary.
So I'm walking her back, and we get 3/4 away around, and we can see the police have arrived, but I'm waving and I can't get their attention. And they
Oh
drive
my
off the other
God.
way. They drive off the other
Oh my
way. It's a
God.
one-way street. And she says, that's it. That means I should go jump. And so I walk with her.
Oh.
I get to the final block before I reach out and I grab her hand, and she yells at me and says, you should never, ever grab my hand or touch me. And I say, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I just want to be helpful. And then I do the neo-dissociation thing. And I say,
Mm-hmm.
I just want the part of you that wants to live to take my hand and come back with me so we can call and get you the help that you deserve. And she took my hand and she came back with me. She went back to the hospital. About 2 or 3 months later, I get a card from her saying something like, the only bridges in my life now are bridges to health and happiness. I then have her come in and interview her because I want to know what helped. So I'm
Sure.
interviewing her and I say, oh, was it that thing I said when I said I want the part of you, and she said,
The technique I learned in school.
yeah, right. And she says, no, that was stupid. That was totally corny. It was stupid. She goes, you know what? The reason that I came with you is because the way you looked. You just looked like you cared. And so that's why I came with you. And so I like to tell that story because I do think the techniques and how we ask is so important. But more important is to be caring, right? If we're not feeling that compassion and that caring for another human in distress, they're going to sense that and be a
They will
little
know.
less
Yeah, they will
willing to
know.
engage. Yeah.
They will know. Thank you, John. Have a
You're welcome.
good rest of the day.
You too.
And do send me your dad's telephone number. Don't forget, okay?
I will get you his number. All right. Thank you, Paula. It's been great to talk.
Thank you.